Zambia's economic fortunes have been under the spotlight for several years now. In November 2020, Zambia opted to bow out of a $42.5 million Eurobond payment, becoming the first African nation to default on its debt in the COVID-19 era. This and several other issues became front and center of the country's election, where incumbent Edgar Lungu lost to President Hakainde Hichilema. Hichilema won the election on a promise to tackle corruption and to end the financial and economic crisis that has seen Zambia's debts ballooning. Now the Zambian government and a team from the International Monetary Fund have an agreement under the Extended Credit Facility for a 3-year lending program worth $1.4 billion. The bailout is for Zambia to help the country in order to restructure its extensive debts. However, the financing is still subject to the IMF management and executive board's approval and receipt of the necessary financing assurances. In late October, Zambia promised to slash its budget deficits and curb borrowing in order to secure IMF support, as well as reduce spending on politically sensitive subsidies. Zambia owes close to $3.5 billion in bilateral debt, $2.1 billion to multilateral lenders, and $2.9 billion to other commercial lenders. It owes close to $3 billion to China and Chinese entities. The copper-producing country failed to make the $42.5 million interest payment expected by investors in its 3 Eurobonds in mid-October. It also was unable to honor payments as at the end of the grace period. What options does Zambia have? How much of an impact will the IMF bailouts make? I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Joining me now from Uganda is Chibamba Kanyama. He's an economist and former communications officer at the International Monetary Fund. Chibamba, welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure always to feature on this program.
All right. So we know that discussions around an IMF bailout have been on for a while. And before the election, former President Edgar Lungu had put together an economic recovery plan in December to try to convince the IMF about how serious his administration was to make economic reforms. But the IMF did not bite. So let's start with that. Why do you think the IMF didn't go for an agreement then, even though it was very obvious that one was needed and one would eventually be reached?
Thank you. The major reason that did not take place is what we call the moving targets on policy agreements. IMF wants to deal with you on basis of credibility. Can they trust you? And when you agree on economic reform benchmarks, are you committed enough to fulfill them, adhere to them, execute them without changing in the course of the program? So we saw the moving targets. On one hand, the IMF is demanding this from government in terms of reforms, one of them being no acquisition of new debts. The very next moment, your debt levels have gone up. And without the knowledge of the IMF, and that is not what was expected of the IMF. So under those circumstances, the IMF felt there was no commitment at leadership level.
So let me ask, if President Hichilema had not won, would we still be seeing the IMF withholding some level of support? Because there were those who did believe that with his winning, it made it easier for the IMF to come in. But if he had not won, what would have happened to the IMF-Zambia conversation?
Remember that the IMF discussions started in 2015, and 2019, government formally requested for fund program. So there was no initial program request until about 4-5 years later. So this has been going on for 7 years. And I don't think that even with the winning of the elections, if the PF won or Mr. Lungu won the elections, I doubt that would be talking about an IMF program today. It could still have been promise after assurance.
So let's move on to the approval that we know now. We know that this staff level agreement still requires the approval of the board, but there are a few things coming out. And one of the interesting things coming out is that Zambia is now required to remove subsidies on energy and agriculture. It was just recently that the finance minister said that the country spends $67 million a month subsidizing fuel. So we've seen for many years that these subsidies are targets of the IMF and the World Bank. But particularly in Zambia's situation, how long have these subsidies been unsustainable?
First of all, these subsidies have been unsustainable for a very long time. Right now, just on fuel alone, we owe more than $400 million US. This is the money we have been paid to the suppliers of fuel. This just tells you the impact of subsidies to the economy, because we still have, even if we had that subsidy, government still has to pay the money for what we have already consumed, outstanding procurement of fuel. So this is definitely unsustainable. If you defaulted to the suppliers, what assurance do you have that you'll be paying those subsidies, meeting those subsidies going forward? But let me just say this, that the subsidy removal is not as what people think there will be. Government is going to look at the supply chains and look at opportunities to save money. That's the first removal of subsidy. The procurement value chains, he talked about one of the refineries in Zambia, in fact, the only refinery government owned, that was inefficient. Government saying we shall not use that route, maybe going forward. We'll allow for efficient supply chains in the country. On agriculture, there will be no removal of subsidy on agriculture. The only thing that will happen, government will rationalize the subsidy on agriculture. This means that all those who illegally accessed subsidies will now be removed. They will not benefit anymore. And some of those who are civil servants who took advantage of this window. So that is the removal of subsidy. And thirdly, government plans to structure subsidy removal to avoid impacting on the poor and also disrupting businesses, because it also seeks to enhance growth and maintain inflation. So it will be well strategically planned and deferred over a period of time. And you may not see removal of subsidy of energy, of fuel and electricity at the same time. There will be some time lag in between.
And you're actually leading me into my next question. And that, of course, looks at Zambians who are bearing the brunt of tough economic times. They're bearing the brunt of coming out of the COVID era. And while there are conversations and debates around who the subsidies truly help, they have been in place for a long time. So you're saying that government is planning to stagger the removal and also to find ways to soften it. Do we have any details on how that will be done? Because removing subsidies at this time, again, aside from being politically sensitive, it's also a very tough economic time for Zambians and many Africans as well.
This will be staggered. I don't have much information on this, but I know that the Minister of Finance will soon be coming to the public to announce the actual steps on how subsidies will be implemented. What I know for sure is that they'll be phased. They will not just be at once. And the minister talked about it yesterday to minimize impact. So they are strategically done. And I know he will start with fuel subsidy and then later on electricity. But even those margins are not as high. These are the subsidies that could still have been removed even if we didn't have an IMF program. For example, increasing fuel prices. This has been happening even without the IMF program. So it will be the usual business, in my opinion. And what I really see in this program, it wasn't imposed. There are no conditionalities per se, actually. Whatever reform measures, what we call the structural benchmarking, these are triggered by the negotiators on the part of government. These are the ones who say, what is the objective here? The objective is to live within means, to spend within means, to bring the fiscal position into balance. So these are the steps we want to take to ensure that there is physical sustainability. That's really all. So all these initiatives government is putting across are not coming from the IMF. They are coming as a priority from the government negotiators. And this is the advantage of having the new IMF and all. The IMF has reformed. Now you can negotiate those conditionalities and they put it to you and say, this is where we should be, what I'm going to do about it. And you choose as a country what measures you are going to do to ensure you don't spend above what you earn.
All right. And it's really interesting you say that, because what we're hearing is that the savings made from these subsidies is going to go into education and health, increasing the money that goes into those areas. Okay, so Chibamba, we're going to go on a quick break. When we come back, I want to take on a statement from Alison Holland, and she's the IMF mission chief in Zambia. She said the agreement is based on authorities' plans to undertake bold and ambitious economic reforms. We want to see what that picture looks like when we come back from the break, so please hold on. You're watching Business Edge right here on News Central. The conversation is around the Zambia and IMF agreement, staff-level agreement that has been reached for $1.4 billion in a 3-year extended facility. How will that money help? And what is the bold, ambitious economic reform? We'll find out after this break. My guest today is Chibamba Kanyama as we look at the Zambia and IMF agreement on an extended loan facility to help the country restructure and also get out of the COVID era issues that it's in. But let's take on some of the comments from Alison Holland. So Chibamba, Alison Holland, the IMF mission chief in Zambia, said that this agreement is based on authorities' plans to undertake bold and ambitious economic reforms. Now, former President Lungu was seen backing away from implementing austerity measures just before the elections when he was attempting to get into some kind of agreement with the IMF. We also have President Hichilema saying in August that he inherited an empty treasury. Beyond the subsidies, what ambitious and bold reforms should Zambians be prepared for? And many people believe that's just saying austerity measures.
These measures have always been there, by the way. They are not new now because Ms. Holland talked about them. We have had Zambia Plus, which was so-called local engineered reform program for Zambia, which didn't succeed. Now, some of the reforms, she identified the biggest problem is debt and sustainable debt position for Zambia, both external debts and domestic debts. We have to do something about that. And to do something about that, we need to realign almost everything at the economic front so that we're in a position not only to pay the debts, and restructure these debts rather, but we're also in a position to have enough, what do they call fiscal space? Fiscal space simply means having enough money remaining for you to spend on other areas of need, social investment in education and health. So she really talked about fiscal and sustainability, that you need to balance your budget. And then she emphasized, for the first time, not heard such much from IMF. Though I worked there myself, I know it is something that is new, but IMF has hardly spoken about it aggressively to the people. It said we need to invest in the people, particularly the youths. And this is about creation of jobs. Next year alone, government plans to employ about 41,000 people in the health sector and education sector. And this is unprecedented, that the IMF gives you are on a program with the IMF, but they are among the conditions that you employ people. No, this is very unique. And also say, move away from unsustainable investments. This is up to the government to say which areas of our economy is not supporting growth, which areas of the public sector is consuming more than it is earning. And the minister hinted on that. Just to give a hint on this, the government is already saying the oil refinery company, the Indeni, is not generating sufficient revenues. It's inefficient, and because of its existence, according to him, we are having high prices of fuel. So he says, look, we are better off getting all the 300 employees who work there and restructure them, re-employ them, deploy them somewhere and close this, because it's just consuming money. And we look for efficient means. She also talked about scaling down subsidies. Of course, that's what I talked about. It's not about removing subsidies, but scaling down, rationalizing subsidies. But the key point here is about value for money in the procurement system. She says, the ambitious program should now allow government to procure efficiently, remove corruption. The infrastructure investments you have embarked on, some of it was 3 times higher than the actual price. You are paying a price because of corruption. Of course, she didn't say that exactly, but that's what she meant. So the ambitious program is about managing public debt, managing public oversight, improving governance systems, improving corruption, making the Bank of Zambia independent than interfering in it, but make it independent, make decisions based on professionalism as per technocrat advice, and of course, having a comprehensive debt restructuring program, which the IMF itself is committing to help Zambia to win off from.
And we're going to talk about debt before we wrap things up. But let me quickly ask, this staff level agreements, $1.4 billion, 3-year extended credit, and it's really going to help bring Zambia one step closer to that comprehensive debt overhaul, as you're saying as well. So in terms of the disbursement, in terms of interest rate, in terms of any details around the money, what else do we know?
This program, of course, it's not dispersed at once.
Yes.
It will be dispersed on milestone. It's a milestone-based disbursement. And the first disbursement Zambia. And the good news about this is that they are the ones who initiated this. They have been pushing for Zambia to have IMF backing so that IMF can guarantee these loans on behalf of Zambia. So this program opens a better window for Zambia to restructure these debts and therefore be able to have sufficient fiscal space, again, having enough money to spend on health and education. So to me, there is nothing hidden about this. It's very transparently done. It will be unlocked as we go on in the next 3 years. The key litmus test here, which is going to be a challenge, is first of all, having public support for IMF program. Zambians are very apprehensive about this program.
Like many Africans.
And I understand the source of this apprehension. Nobody feels IMF can deliver value for the country, can create jobs, can create growth for the economy. Many of them are seeing doom out of this. So it's how government communicates this message to the stakeholders, to the public, and having public acceptance, including the trade unions. The good thing, though, that this program does not include freezing of employment, does not include freezing of salaries or wages for the civil service. It is silent on that. It's not included. So at least they have helped us to manage the critical fears that the people of Zambia had about the IMF program.
Okay, so let me ask that. So it seems that you believe this is quite a good start, because there are some questions as to whether or not it's in a way enough. There are still questions as to the true level of Zambia's debt, particularly in relation to China. We are hearing that Zambia owes foreign lenders an estimated $16 billion. The debt burden is above 120% of the GDP, and credit ratings from S&P Global says the country spends at least 30% of its revenue on interest payments. $1.4 billion in relation to that, it seems like almost a drop in the bucket, but all the other things surrounding it, do you think this is a good enough start?
It's a good enough start. First of all, remember that the 1.4 billion, which is about 900 million SDR, is possibly the maximum benchmark Zambia can get. I'm actually surprised IMF gave it all. It's an indication of confidence to the country. It's not so much about the 1.4 billion. It's so much about the opportunities that Zambia will now have with its creditors to restructure debt. This is more than the money that IMF is giving us. It's not enough. It's about how much are we going to leverage this. This is about borrowed credibility. Now we can go to the creditor and say, look, can we restructure these debts? We are not able to pay you during the time frame that these debts are due. Can you cancel some of these debts? And so there'll be so much that will be negotiated. But above that, and the minister said it yesterday, that government is going to look for resources now from bilateral and multilateral donors. And I know personally that there have been a number of bilateral donors, these different European governments that have wanted to support Zambia, to support what we call budget support, to finance the budget itself, but have been reluctant in the past 7 years. So we cannot do it because there's no transparency. And go on an IMF. If you get an IMF program, then we shall support you. So the bulk of the revenue for 2021 going forward will come from these bilateral donors. And to me, this program unlocks everything beyond the 1.4 billion that we're getting.
Okay, so my last question, because we have to wrap up, unfortunately, is at that creditor's question that you've mentioned. There have been some fears expressed that debt relief from China and loans from the IMF will in turn be used to make huge profits for the bondholders of Zambia. Now, China agreed to suspend Zambian debt payments when the pandemic began, but the bondholders refused, and we all remember that. Now, the initial bonds were lent to Zambia at high interest rates, supposedly because the country was high risk. So we're at this point now where many believe that if there's no agreement on large-scale debt cancellation for Zambia, then the country should be at a different place. And the IMF and G20 should be leading that charge to get that large-scale debt cancellation. What do you think about these fears that some of this money may end up more in terms of paying off Zambia's bondholders? Very quickly, because of time.
First of all, it would be disastrous if the creditors refuse. They're the ones who pushed us this far. They're the ones who said, please get on an IMF program, then we can talk. So we got this now, staff level agreement. We should start talking. That's the first thing. The second one is that we are guaranteed now with an IMF program. This is good news. We are guaranteed to service the first bullet payment for the Eurobond next year of 750 million US dollars. We are going to service it now. We can pay it off the 1.4 billion. And then we can move on. So at least one big hurdle for 2022 has been resolved. Thank you.
All right, Chibamba, thank you so much. As more details come out and when we get to the point of the management and executive board signing, we'll definitely renew this conversation and bring about the updates. Thank you so much for touching base with us.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
All right. And you see, he ends this conversation with a smile because it does look like the future is bright with Zambia and the opportunities that this 1.4 billion three-year extended facility from the IMF brings. In 2022, can Zambia get back on the path of economic prosperity, restructure its debt, and start paying down its payments? That's a conversation we'll keep until next year. This is Business Edge. Up next is NC4 to watch. And NC4 to watch starts in the eastern parts of the continent, where Kenya's private sector hiring increased in November, growing the fastest in 2 years. This points to increased workload after lifting the 18-month nighttime curfew imposed to contain the spread of COVID-19. The overall Purchasing Managers Index reading for November rose to 53 from 51.4. Nigeria's foreign trade in goods statistics for quarter 3 of 2021 has revealed that the country imported $185 billion, billion naira worth of used vehicles. The Statistician General, Simon Harry, said Nigeria's total merchandise trade rose to 13.3 trillion naira in Q3 of 2021, representing 10.43% increase over the 12.02 trillion naira recorded in Q2. High fossil fuel prices may jeopardize efforts to pivot to cleaner renewable energy sources. This is coming from the leader of one of Europe's largest oil companies. At the World Petroleum Congress, Total Energy's SE Chief Executive Officer Patrick Punyoya explained that a prolonged period of elevated prices for fuels such as natural gas might jeopardize the development of alternatives. And finally, Air France has confirmed that flights between Paris, Johannesburg, and Cape Town are to resume and will operate on schedule this month. This is possible because France has lifted the flight suspension, but this is subject to the application of a new set of protocol. Now, regardless of vaccination status, all travelers from South Africa are subject to a list of requirements such as a travel certificate, a negative PCR test conducted less than 48 hours prior, or an antigen test carried out less than 24 hours before the flight. And that's Business Edge for you today. Don't forget to join us 11 a.m. West African time, Monday through Friday, where we put the big business, economic, and financial stories coming out of the continent front and center. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Have a pleasant day.